Hello, welcome to AT&T Threat Track. This is June 8th, 2012. This program provides network security news and highlights with discussion on cyber threats. Today we have joining us Dave Gross, Jim Clausing, John Hogaboom, and I'm Brian Rexroad. And let's go ahead and get right into it. Jim, it seems like there have been a whole pile of vulnerabilities out this week, but it sounds like you have some discussion on an exploit and a couple of other items, huh?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. There are a couple of things that I wanted to talk about this week. The first was a story that came out Monday or Tuesday about an authentication bypass vulnerability in the MySQL database if it had been compiled using certain libraries, certain versions of the underlying libc library. And the issue was if it was compiled with the proper version that would return a return value outside of what they were prepared to handle, you could actually bypass the authentication completely. And it was really simple to set this up. I actually did it on a machine I had at home before Ubuntu pushed out the updated MySQL. And you just put it in a loop, run the same attempt to authenticate with a bad password for the root user, which is defined in most MySQL databases as the owner of the MySQL tables. And if you run it enough times in a row, you'd get in. Your chances are 1 in 256, but on average, if you run it 1,000 times, you're likely to get in.
So you can even use the same guess over and over and over again, and
absolutely. I used the same guess that was the password I was guessing was garbage, and it got me in. So this is a big deal. There were a number of vendors who their Linux distributions that are 64-bit OSs, the versions of MySQL they provided on their 64-bit versions of OSs tended to be vulnerable. And it's all in the story and the advisory. The link is on the page here, and it'll be on the Threat Track Tech Channel webpage. Fortunately, the vendors are starting to patch those, or if you compile it yourself and don't use the vulnerable version of libc, you should be fine. Okay. But one of the things that happened though almost immediately is there's a Metasploit module out that takes advantage of this. So, first things first, don't be exposing your MySQL databases any places. We talk about this all the time in the Internet Weather Report. They shouldn't be visible, to the Internet. You should have them firewalled so that you're only, your application server can talk to them, but otherwise, you want to lock down access to that. This could be done across the Internet if the port was open.
Mm-hmm. Now, I was just taking a look at what we've seen in terms of reconnaissance activity on this port. That's port 3306 TCP, and it's not actually in the weather report for the report today. But what I can say is that we haven't seen anything significant since the vulnerability this exploit was announced or made available or known at least. There was sort of a spike in activity, I guess, dating back to about the 8th of June, just about a week ago. So that's a little bit interesting, but nothing unusual. So I guess we should be keeping an eye on this to make sure that there isn't anything sort of going on that's unusual, and make sure that gets reported if it does come up.
Absolutely. Check to see if your version is vulnerable. And if it is, update it.
I would think this potentially might be a big issue for those web hosting providers out there that have those LAMP-type platforms where there's lots of MySQL servers out there that they're hosting for users. I know a lot of those vendors kind of lock them down so that you have to be on one of their other servers to access their MySQL server, but, there's probably a bunch that are still exposed in some way. So I would think that that's a big issue for them, too.
Yeah, hopefully, as I said, the Linux distros will be pushing updates and they'll be automatically applied, hopefully.
Okay. So it sounds like we have some other things to talk about as well, right?
Yeah, the other one that I wanted to take a look at, and this bulletin came out from U.S. CERT on Tuesday, and I didn't notice it until this morning. But the bulletin describes an issue with 64-bit operating systems, and they talk about privilege escalation on Intel 64-bit hardware. But where I've actually seen this talked about outside of the U.S. CERT bulletin is Xen 64-bit hypervisors running 64-bit operating systems. This vulnerability allows a guest to escape and attack the host. So, virtual machines running under a 64-bit Xen hypervisor can escape, and you can actually attack the host this way, which virtual machine escape has been, something that we've been talking about for a number of years. And so this is the first one that I recall seeing for Xen, but the details are a little sketchy in the bulletin. But it seems pretty clear that it only happens on 64-bit Intel hardware. If you get 64-bit AMD hardware, this vulnerability doesn't seem to affect those.
So, Jim, is that implying that there's a flaw in the hardware itself? Is that what we conclude from this, or is it, ultimately, who owns the fix for this?
Well, that's a good question. It seems that somehow the hardware is returning something that the operating systems are then not handling properly. But if you read through the bulletin at cert.org there, it affects Linux, it affects FreeBSD, it affects Windows 64-bit versions of those OSs. So, yeah, I believe that there may actually be some patches for some of those OSs out now to properly handle the result that it's getting back. But it's not entirely clear from reading the bulletin, and I haven't looked through all of the vendor bulletins that also address this.
So I guess with very few exceptions, the de facto standard rule is the hardware is always right and the software must accommodate. There was a case. I don't know if maybe I'm going back a little too far here, but there was a flaw that was recognized in Pentium processors that were related, and I guess this was perhaps 10 years ago, that there was a math calculation error that would occur, and I think that was the only documented case that I'm aware of where they actually pinned it down on the hardware to be flawed. But I think since then, it's the assumption is the software can adapt to any flaws that exist in the hardware.
Right. It's much easier to update the software than it is the hardware. So.
Right. Mm-hmm. Well, and that's argued both directions. That because of the investment that goes into creating the hardware, at least traditionally, a heck of a lot of effort went into making sure that the hardware behaved specifically in the way that it was designed and intended to behave. And that behavior was restricted or constrained to the things that you knew you could make predictable and test and verify that it was operating in the way you wanted. then the left was, a mere, the simple task of software. And so there's that sort of that notion that the software adapts to what flaws might exist in the hardware, but there's also a heck of a lot more effort gone into preparing the hardware to make sure that it does, in fact, behave as it should. But invariably, we should expect that there are flaws in that, and that we just need to deal with it.
Right, and it seems also, this only affects 64-bit.
Right.
So there may be a subtle difference in the way this type of instruction works under 64-bit versus 32-bit, and a lot of the software probably assumed that it kind of worked the same way in both.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe true. The other thing that I think the fact that we're talking about virtualization here, this has been, as you sort of alluded to, or in fact sort of mentioned, Jim, this is a big deal from a cloud computing point of view. That is, that virtualization, the ability to constrain, a given user and what they can do, has a significant impact on how much you can rely on cloud computing from a security standpoint. And we don't necessarily want to have to trust our neighbors when we're sharing a particular platform with them. And it sort of pushes toward, you really should be working with a cloud provider that, can give you some assurance or some controls around who you're sharing a platform with and what the circumstances might be.
Right. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to mention this. This is a big deal if these updates, in a cloud environment, and we've talked about this in previous shows, in a cloud environment, who's responsible for which updates? If the OS gets updated, who's going to apply those patches? If the hypervisor gets updated, how timely is the patching from the hosting provider? These are all things that we need to worry about.
Right, and as more applications go to the cloud, there's going to be more attempts to break out of these environments to, see if there's a way to intrude on other areas that some of these attackers don't generally have access to. I mean, I want to go to, some of those escape type of shows in a theater or something like that, watch a magician do it, not see it in a hosting environment.
Yeah, very good. All right, thank you for that, Jim. And I guess we'll want to keep these things in mind as we go forward. And this must be the week of exploits here, Dave. It sounds like you have a little bit of a different twist on exploits to share with us.
Yes, thank you, Brian. And this one is very similar to the first one that Jim was talking about also. This one has to do with exploits on a particular vendor's products. It's F5 Networks. And last Wednesday on the 6th, they issued an alert saying that there's a authentication bypass vulnerability to get access to the root of the various of their devices, and they list the type of devices that they have. I'm not that familiar with what all these devices do, but they do say the types of things they do are load balancing and some sort of web acceleration and SSL offloading, so there's accelerators in there. And they also do some access control and application security and things like that.
So we're not talking about home routers here. We're talking about the big stuff that's fronting big, web hosting environments.
That's right. So these would be larger devices that would be commercially deployed. So anyhow, what this vulnerability actually is there's SSH keys that are used for access to the root accounts remotely, and evidently those keys, the private key for using those, has been discovered. And so the alert was issued on 6.6 with the fix, so there's a patch now that you can get. And anybody that has F5 devices, please look at the alert and patch your device as soon as possible, because within a week of that alert coming out, it was added to Metasploit. Does this sound familiar, Jim? Like what you were talking about in your story. And so now it's publicly available, so anybody can go ahead and get it. And so the big vulnerability here is that there's a remote root access to the devices available, depending on what other network access issues you have, whatever other network access protections you have there. Also, they mentioned that there was a blog that a security researcher had written, and evidently this was actually discovered by the security researcher back in February. So this has been known since February, but they kept it quiet. They, disclosed it to F5. F5 worked through all their products, figuring out what they needed to do, and then, got this together. But you see, from the time that it was issued as an alert, it was a week or less where it became public, and so you really have to be on top of these things and patch them very quickly, especially major things like this that can give you remote root access.
Yeah, absolutely true. And, I think you alluded to this, Dave. You mentioned the notion of network protections. This is an opportunity or a case where there certainly would be an opportunity in most situations to use network controls. That is, there are probably only certain places where you really need to be able to get root access to the machine through SSH. Use a network control to say, control where that can come from so that you don't have to be, it wouldn't bypass the patching here, but you certainly wouldn't have to be worried about the fact that this had probably, we don't know how long it's been actually accessible to hackers and what they've done with it between the time that it was discovered, or perhaps, before that researcher had even discovered it, somebody else had discovered it.
Right.
Right. The only from your network management segment, and not, general machines shouldn't be able to SSH into your network devices anyway.
Right.
Yep, and this may also be a function of how the whole thing runs. They may have their own type of controller box that helps control and configure the lower-level devices as well.
Mm-hmm. One of those aspects of the sort of the network controls, this is, again, one of those factors that you want to take into consideration with when you're working with a cloud service provider. Can they provide back channels that are not exposed to the Internet as a part of their service? And you want to work something out with your cloud provider to make sure that that's a capability they're willing to offer you. And if they're not, what I would recommend do is find somebody else that will.
Mm-hmm.
So, hey, Dave, is it the case that they use like a public-private key here and their private key escaped somehow?
Yeah, that's what it looks like.
Yeah. Is there any discussion of how that private key escaped?
I hadn't seen any.
I haven't heard.
Just curious.
Yep. It's a legitimate question. If the private key was leaked out, it could have been that somebody was able to hack into their environment, or I think we had a discussion about a similar kind of situation last week where, maybe it was 2 weeks ago, forgive me, but where the private information got actually distributed with the product.
Right.
I think that was 2 weeks ago. We were talking about an application signing key that got distributed. Isn't that right?
That was
yes. Yep, that was in the Chrome environment.
That's exactly right. Yeah, you covered that one, Dave. Now that you remind me.
Yeah, but the issue here is that there's probably a part of this infrastructure that actually has the private key to be able to go in and administer these other devices. So it might be that somebody did some reverse engineering or something to discover that key, and then they were able to disclose that. But that also does show you a couple of other things that obscurity, security through obscurity doesn't work that well. It works for a while until it's discovered, and then you're kind of wide open. And the other thing is the issue of least privilege. If there was a way to do what they needed to do without the root access, it's still bad to have remote access, but it's not as bad to have total root access.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, it's not clear that you can do what they need to do that way, but all I'm saying is, they should explore that, and in general, that's a good policy to follow.
And if it's the latter, if the private key is hard-coded someplace else, just updating it now isn't going to stop somebody from doing whatever they did to reverse engineer it the last time. So if that's the issue, then they need to make a more fundamental design change at some point.
Right, and it wasn't clear what the actual patch was, so they may have done something more extensive than just changing the keys.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, thanks for that. That's very insightful. I think, the twist here being it's a whole entire different sort of product line that we need to be paying attention to. It's not just the computers, but also the network devices that are supporting them. So let's go ahead and move on to the next segment of our program here today. This is a regular segment related to unsolicited bulk email. And, John, any new developments that you'd like to share with us?
Thanks, Brian. Not a whole lot of new developments, some small changes here, and there's one particular thing I'm going to make a call out to at the end here to keep people warned about in a vague sort of way, I will. But in any event, so this is our unsolicited bulk email report, basically the spam malware report. As we've talked about before, the way we collect this information is we have a bunch of kind of bogus email accounts distributed out onto our ATC.net, bellsouth.net services, and if they receive email, they're not tied to any real users, so if they receive email, we collect all that together, and we have a pretty good picture of the type of spam that's being distributed at will across the internet, in an unsolicited manner. So when we look at the trends for this week, this is a little interesting. We've got a much larger amount of spam than we've seen in previous weeks. Usually we hover around 1 million. This is about doubled, so that's kind of interesting. I'm not sure what accounts for this because I didn't have a lot of time to go take a look at it. I can see that a lot of the counts are up higher of just the general spam in general. It could be that we've added more probe accounts of these bogus accounts out there, and we're just collecting more of the same kind of stuff just from more endpoints now, or more email accounts, rather. But I didn't go to verify that yet.
Okay.
In terms
John,
of what
we
we're
need
seeing,
to give you more time in each day.
Yes, I need more time. In terms of what we're seeing most often here, most of it is just our regular spam that we talk about, phishing, blah, 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 that we can't really determine exactly what's going on in there. For the ones that we can without attachments inside, we do see a few that have potentially malicious links in there. We'll take a look at some of those. And then in terms of attachments, we see this is a little bit elevated too from last week, but not as much of a change. This is a double amount here, 2 million versus this number, which is probably only like a 15% increase, I think, over last week. So that's kind of interesting. In any event, numbers are pretty much on par relative to what we saw last week in terms of what was blocked that was a known malicious attachment versus which ones got slipped through. The types of files we're seeing, RTF, doc, PDF, these are our usual heavy hitters here that we always see towards the top. The ones to be really concerned about or to take a closer look at are the zips, EXEs, .scr. We did see a little campaign going with .scr. We'll take a look at some of those. That's the majority of the ones that we see that would be ones I'd be cautious about. In terms of topics, no real big change here, but these numbers are bigger. So last week, I think we had the largest number was in the 20,000 range for the highest one. Now we've got about 50,000 almost for the 4 foods that kill fat and 7 food chemicals that cause it. Obviously, some just kind of general spam. Again, a lot of these are all, spam-type topics here. The empty topic, again, not at the top of the leaderboard, which is 2 weeks in a row now. That's a little bit unusual. Some of these coupon ones, Groupon, et cetera, we've seen in previous ones as well. So no real big changes here. If we look at the types of subjects we're seeing, no big changes here either. Free is always in the top. And again, this is a word cloud I kind of put together via Wordle.net, which if you haven't checked it out, is kind of a neat little tool. The larger the word is, the more times it appeared in the subject line of the emails that we saw, the spam emails. Some ones that I would call out that I noticed interesting, Obama is in here. FedEx.
Got into the campaign season here.
Yeah, FedEx. Some of these smaller ones are sometimes more interesting. We talked about maybe doing a flip version of this, but FedEx we know shows up. Did you have something there, Jim?
Bed bugs.
Bed bugs.
Yeah, getting into getting into the summer season here, people are going to be probably getting more concerned about bed bugs again.
Right. I see Groupon
but a lot of comments
also
that we see pretty frequently. Experian, I think we saw last week as well, et cetera, et cetera. I don't really see any others in particular. Just another kind of way to visualize some of the common subject keywords that we see. So when we look at emails that had links inside them, they didn't have an attachment in the spam, but they had a link inside. Not a lot this week, but the ones that got through, most of them were in Spanish or Brazilian, or I can't tell what language, but one of those two. And they contained links to executables that Portuguese. Our producer is indicating Portuguese here. But the links here are pointing to executables, and when you do some analysis of those, you'll see that they do show up as malware. This one's a little interesting. This is a kind of poorly detected backdoor Trojan, so that would be one to be cautious of. If you see something for face hacker as a subject line, don't open that one and execute it. I'm particularly cautious of backdoor ones. Those are the kinds of malware Trojans that give somebody remote control of your machine, typically. They're not usually just general malware they're going to try to use your machine to add into their spamming or DDoS or other general type of criminal type stuff. It's more of a remote access kind of thing, usually, these backdoor Trojans.
I'm kind of curious about the pitch behind that attachment with the subject line of face hacker. Is this some kind of tool they're offering that to do something funky with Facebook?
I'm guessing it is, but I didn't look at the subject. And this is 2 weeks in a row we've seen this one show up. So I probably should take a closer look at the actual email itself and see what they're trying to pitch. I'm going to guess that it is some kind of Facebook hacking tool or something like that.
Or at least claims that it is.
Yeah, and in reality, it's got some kind of Trojan in it. And nothing else real unexpected here beyond what we normally see. Now, in terms of the spams that had attachments in them that our antivirus is able to detect and remove before delivering to the email box, this is what we normally see. Now, last week we had a pretty big departure. Smuller was gone. He was not even on the chart. I think Fake AV was the top one, and I can't remember. There are two others that were battling it out for second and third place that were kind of close to where Fake AV was. So Smuller has really come back strong. We'll take a look at some of those subject lines. 69% of the spam detected were of type Smuller. Fake AV was the next largest, and Trojan Generic was the next at 6%. MyTob is a campaign we talk about all the time, specifically targeting ATT.net users. And then there's some other smaller ones in here that we've seen on occasion. Dromedon has slipped down at the bottom of the pack. On occasion, we see big Dromedon runs where we see tons of spam with Dromedon samples inside. This was not one of those weeks, so he's back down at the bottom of the pool there.
So this tells me, when you see inconsistencies in activity like that, where smaller floats to the top, and undisputably the top attachment in this week, and then last week it wasn't there, it tells me that you don't have a whole lot of organizations that are distributing this stuff. It's basically a one or two or a handful, and when they decide to take a week off, it's noticeable.
Right. Yeah, or they take some time to replan their strategy, and then the following week we see a big run of it again or something. Right. So it'll be interesting to see if we see Dropodon spike up again. So let's keep that in mind, because normally it is in there. It's definitely usually higher than last place. So I found that a little interesting. So I would expect it to pop back up towards the top again in the future.
I wonder if there's any such thing as advertising in the underground for wanting to get customers for doing spam.
I think there absolutely would be.
Yeah, I think there is absolutely. We should probably do a show on that at some point. In any event, block spam email subjects. So these are the subject lines that we saw here. Dropodon, the few that we did see with Dropodon, this is not in order of most to least, but DHL was the topic, the campaign that they were using. Again, a lot of these parcel delivery services like FedEx, UPS, DHL, a lot of these spams purport to be that they have an attachment inside and they try to trick you into thinking they had trouble delivering a package to you, and you open the attachment, you get infected. We see that with the fake AV. They're using FedEx as their victim, so to speak. They're pretending to be that company. This one, there was another fake AV that's purporting to pass around some illicit pictures inside. I had to censor this one a little bit. But I think these are two different people. I think this is one guy running this fake AV campaign, and I think this is another guy doing the FedEx ones. That's just a guess on my behalf. Trojan Generic is doing FedEx stuff, and so is Smoller. There's probably some overlap with Trojan Generic and Smoller, where they classified it as a generic Trojan before they got a Smoller-specific detection signature there. When we go to the next page, again, Smoller, lots of these are parcel, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And Kanta, which we've seen week in, week out in small amounts, still targeting Amazon, or they're pretending to be Amazon, that there was a problem with your Amazon order. And they're also doing one indicating that a friend on Twitter wants to, link with you or something. And MyTab, as we talked about, is specifically targeting AT&T users, trying to indicate that your AT&T account has issues.
All right. Yeah, actually, some of these, before you go on there, John, some of these ones at the bottom here were detected online user violation and, let's see, accounts suspended for security reasons, that sort of thing. We've been trying to find ways to notify customers when they have problems, and, one of the troubles with trying to notify them through email is that it's very difficult to make a distinction between one of these scams that are being spammed around and actual, notifications that have tangible, information behind them. And that's been one of our challenges. We've been working on this with the DNS changer malware. We've talked about that on the program a few times, but trying to get notifications out to customers, even sending, paper letters out to customers that are affected by that. But the fact that this spamming activity associated with malware behind it is evidence to the fact that it's more challenging than you might expect.
Right. But I'll tell you this. If you get an email like this and it's purporting to be from AT&T and it's got an attachment inside, it's not us. I can pretty much guarantee you we're not going to send you an attachment, especially with an executable inside, indicating that your password's expired or something.
Absolutely.
In terms of some of these things, these are ones that slipped through. No real big changes here. We saw Depato last week. Some of these fake AVs made it through before it was detected. Before we move over to the Internet Weather Report, one thing I want to make people aware of, there is a campaign going on the past week here. I did not bring up a sample of it. It's a different kind that we've talked about in the past. It's a spam that has a link in it, takes you to a web page that has a cross-site scripting vulnerability in it. And what it's doing is if you've already logged into a very popular Internet service, I'm not going to name their name right now, but if you've already logged in there and then you click on the link in this email, you have a cookie in your browser for that popular internet service. When you go to this link in the email, they use a cross-site scripting vulnerability that service has a problem that they're addressing. That's why I don't really want to call them out just yet, and they're fixing it. But what will happen is the attacker who created this link and this cross-site scripting vulnerability can steal your cookie and therefore log in as you. They can just take that cookie from yours. They steal your cookie and they put it into their browser, and now they can just browse to that website as though they are you, and then change your password or do whatever else they want to do. So something to be aware of. Most of it, just to let you know what the subject line is. The subject line will be hi or hey, and the contents will say something very generic like, hey, check this out, and it'll have a link in it. So just be warned of that. But I didn't want to give an example because I'd like to give that particular company a chance to fix that problem before we let the world know about it.
Yeah, I'm sure that's an appropriate thing to do. So, John, is there a way to protect yourself from these kinds of things? And I think it sounds like what you're alluding to is one of these features that's a cookie-based feature that says, once you visited the place, you have an option to say, remember me, and it basically, or keep me logged in kind of thing. And is that the situation here?
Well, kind of yes and no. You have a cookie in your browser. It can even be a non-persistent one. And when you go to this vulnerable page on this hosting provider, because they can inject other code into there from a third-party site, it will allow them to just basically record the document.cookie of that popular site. And now, in terms of how to protect yourself with that, I guess log out more frequently. There are some, and Jim might have some other recommendations. I know there's one tool I use, Sandboxy, which has some ability to, I'm sorry, not Sandboxy. What's the one we run in our browser? 1 second. You know what I'm talking about, the one that prevents JavaScript.
Oh, NoScript.
NoScript has some detections for cross-site scripting type vulnerabilities. So that would be some measure of protection, but it gets tricky. When it's a very popular site like this, you might, even with NoScript, you might say, I allow them to run scripts because I trust this well-known service provider, and it still might execute. But they might have some detection of the cross-site scripting. I didn't actually check to see if NoScript would pick that up.
Okay.
Yeah. And there's been some attempt, and I'm hoping that the browser makers will do this some more in the future to isolate individual threads, individual tabs, so that you're not necessarily sharing. Essentially, run a separate thread for a separate tab, and not share information between them. That might help in something like this, but, in general, you need to be logged out completely, clear your cookies, and don't click on links in emails.
Right.
Yeah, it's a tough one to protect against.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's, as you suggested, it's really something that the site operator should be paying more attention to. And,
yeah.
This cross-site scripting problem has been somewhat of an epidemic for some time now, and time that it really gets addressed. Okay, so thank you, John. That was very good, and appreciate the sort of the add-on at the end there. The next thing we'll do here is we'll talk about what we affectionately call the Internet Weather Report. It'll look at anomalies in terms of ports and protocols, reconnaissance activity, and that sort of thing. And we only really have a handful of things to cover in terms of anomalies today. And actually it translates into actually 3 specific events. I've changed the order a little bit on this table. That is, normally have them ordered in terms of our assigned priorities here, but what I've done here is grouped a couple together. This first 2, port 23 scanning activity and port 210 scanning activity, those are related, so we'll address those together. And then this scanning activity on port 143 and port 110 are related, partly because they're the same sort of application. That is, port 143 is IMAP, that's Internet Mail Access Protocol, and then port 110 is POP3, or Post Office Protocol version 3. And then it turns out that actually both of these two are related. They're all associated with the same botnet, so we'll take a look at that. And then this next one is actually scanning activity associated with a proxy, or relatively unknown proxy application, probably associated with malware. I don't know the specifics behind the application itself, but this is port 36081. We have reported on scanning activity on this port in the past, and I'll show you what we have on that. So, first of all, this scanning activity, what I'll call continued scanning sources on port 23 TCP as well as port 210 TCP. This is that botnet that we have discussed. It's associated with webcam or security camera DVRs. Continues to be predominantly mostly sources in China. Actually, I can't verify exactly that Korea is still a player in this. I presume they are, and also victims in the United States as well. And they may be targeting other embedded systems. That basically it looks like what they're doing is looking for applications where either through a web interface or through a telnet interface or through some other interface that may be product specific, that they're able to get into the device and inject malware and take it over, turn it into a bot effectively. One of the observations that I have here is that the scanning activity, the pattern of scanning activity currently shows to be very localized. That is, if you look at the patterns, it's really looking at the local subnet in terms of scanning activity predominantly. Doesn't seem to be spreading too much beyond that point. So the scanning activity itself doesn't look very aggressive. It's what I would describe as sort of a low and slow kind of activity, but it certainly is prominent in terms of the number of sources that are doing that scanning, and we're measuring in terms of thousands here, approaching 10,000, close to 10,000 sources that are doing the scanning activity in our measurements. One thing that is sort of an interesting observation is over the last week or so, this scanning activity on port 210 has been relatively steady, whereas we've seen a lot of very spurious scanning activity in the previous week. So I'm not sure why that might be, but there's certainly perhaps maybe a change that was made that allows it to be more persistent, not as dependent on command and control perhaps. But certainly, we want to continue to track this one and see if we can find ways to block it. This next one here is scanning activity, and this is, again, sources that are scanning on port 143 TCP. As I mentioned, that's Internet Mail Access Protocol, and port 110 TCP, Post Office Protocol version 3. I'm showing 30 days of data here, and as you can see, the number of sources scanning on these ports is relatively zero on a given day. But what we see here is a significant spike. I think it showed up just at the end of the day on the 8th. Perhaps into the 9th. It spiked up to about 4,000 sources, a little over that, and then dropped off. And then overlaying both these ports in terms of the number of sources that were scanning, they correlate almost exactly in terms of time. So it turns out that the sources that were doing this scanning activity have significant overlap with the participants in the botnet that we were just talking about that was doing scanning on port 23 and port 210. Now, the reason I kept these separate is because it's likely that the purpose of this scanning is different here. That is, in the previous case, it was likely trying to propagate the botnet, find more bots to incorporate into the botnet. This one, I suspect, has a different purpose. I suspect this is either looking for opportunities to steal email from users or by accessing their accounts, or maybe performing some sort of password guessing or something of that sort, or looking for some other, maybe method to get into systems, but perhaps not to necessarily to bot those systems.
They might also be looking for a way to send spam. I mean, they might be able to, if they can guess the password, actually use that for an avenue to send it out.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I have a couple of honeypots that I have running all the time that periodically I see password guessing attacks against port 143. Not as much against port 110, although some of the biggies, the Googles and the Yahoos, some of them still have port 110 unencrypted passwords flying across the internet to those kinds of sites. So there's still a lot of password guessing that I see in my honeypots against these ports.
Okay. Just one last comment on this. So last week we reported, again, overlap with sources that are participating as a part of this bot having been scanning on port 81 TCP. Again, this was a case where it looked like they were trying to identify other alternate accesses to web applications that sometimes, so there you don't have collisions with port 80 activity, they'll assign a web interface to devices on port 81. The reason I brought this up again is that I was a little speculative about the purpose of scanning in that case when we reported last week, but we did later verify that, in fact, some of these applications like the DVR cameras do provide a web interface on port 81, so that may be the motivation for doing that scanning activity on that port. Next item here, this is scan sources again on port 36081 TCP. There isn't really an official application assigned to this port, and what I would describe here is activity, what I would describe as low and slow scanning activity. So, this is oftentimes the case when we're looking at the number of sources that are scanning. That is when somebody that's doing reconnaissance activity is able to engage a botnet that is engaged hundreds in this case, but in the previous case, so literally thousands of machines to do that scanning activity. What they will tend to do in many cases is only probe very slowly, so that so long as they have the patience to do it, they can cover the internet with a small number of addresses in a relatively reasonable amount of time. So the significance here is that if you are on the receiving side of these probes, you may not recognize that this probe from this one IP address and another probe from another IP address is in fact associated with the same actor, but it turns out that many times that is the case, that they are related. So in any case, this one is a little bit unique. Where these scans are originating from is actually from at least 5 U.S.-based cloud providers. So it appears that what's happening is either through an exploit, they're gaining access to virtual machines, or they've actually purchased access to those virtual machines. It's not as if there are dozens of different providers involved here. It's a small number. We're only looking at, about a peak here, about 130 sources. So this is not real significant in terms of the counts compared to many of the other things we've talked about. And this port is associated with anonymizing proxies, so most likely up to no good in terms of the scanning activity associated with this. And there's a link here to Mr. Hinky Dink's blog that describes his findings associated with port 36081. This dates back to, I think, December 2011 when he posted this. In fact, it shows in the directory structure here. So feel free to go take a look at his blog, and this is the only information I was able to find that ties that port to any particular application. Moving on, here's basically the pie chart that shows the most probed ports out of the top 10 ports. Port 445, as usual, is on the top. Port 1433, close follower. Next one here is port 3389 TCP. This is typical for this port to show up at this level. That's remote desktop protocol, and I believe there was a new vulnerability that was recently made public associated with this, or patches associated with that.
Yeah, this week was Microsoft Patch Tuesday. We didn't talk about those today, but one of the patches that was released was a critical one related to remote desktop protocol. And from the description, I would be worried about this one. It's sounds like it's possible to do remote unauthenticated access, so it's the kind that would likely be turned into a worm. Now, as of earlier today, I still hadn't heard of any reports of the exploit being out in the wild, but it's one that needs to be, apply those patches in a timely fashion.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, that's it's MS12-036 for those who want to read up on that one.
Yeah,
but definitely something to be worried about.
Yeah, absolutely. Any exposure of RDP basically puts is even more vulnerable, despite the fact that you may have a good password or good access controls on it. So this is one I agree we should be paying very close attention to. We haven't seen any anomalies in terms of reconnaissance activity, but considering the amount of reconnaissance activity that takes place, anybody that's interested in getting access to remote desktop protocol platforms already has an inventory of addresses where those servers reside at this point. So I don't necessarily expect that there'll be reconnaissance, although as Jim mentioned, it is what we call a wormable exploit, or appears to be a wormable, if there was an exploit associated with this, and a wormable vulnerability, I should say. And so being wormable, if there is something that's propagating, we would likely be able to pick that up in our reconnaissance activity. Next one's typical port 22, that's secure shell, port 23, Telnet. We talked a little bit about Telnet a little bit earlier. And then port 27977 still is making it into the top 10. This is that backdoor or basically a sort of a proxy port associated with, loosely associated with TDSS rootkit. This was another one that was identified by Mr. Hinky Dinky, and so you can check his blog for information on that. And then last but not least, port 8080 TCP covering. And then we have, perhaps about just less than about 20% of the remainder are in the other category, of which there are numerous ports that are being probed. Next one is the most sources probing, and far and above is port 445, as we've mentioned many times. This is configgers and infections that are remnant, as well as mimickers of the configure sort of exploits. Port 23 we mentioned. We already talked about port 3389, and we talked early in the program about port 210. These other ports that are sort of shaded out here show up as probing activity, but it's really sort of peer-to-peer activity that's not considered to be security relevant. It's either gaming or messaging applications.
I do find it interesting that three of them, though, are in the 16,400 range UDP.
Yes. So those are actually associated with Apple applications. Apple has basically a dynamic port assignment mechanism that chooses a series in that range.
Okay.
So with that, we welcome your feedback to the program. You can find us at threattrack@list.att.com if you want to give us feedback, suggestions for the program. The video content is available on the AT&T Tech channel. The best way to get there is att.com/threattrack. That's spelled THREATTRAQ. You can also find us on YouTube. You can search for that threat track term. It's also available in audio format through iTunes and through FeedBurner. Again, search for the threat track term. And if you have interest in other security topics or additional sort of written discussion from participants in the program, our blogs are available at networkingexchangeblog.att.com/topics/security. And with that, thank you, Jim, Dave, and John for joining today. And thank you, audience, for joining. I'm Brian Rexroad. Until next time, keep your network safe.